Hello again, folks, and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. This is the virtual version, of course. We continue today in our study of 2 Maccabees. This is lesson 2 in that series. And in our study here, we're pointing out those areas that scholars tell us are significant, primarily significant religiously, that are additions found in 2 Maccabees that you don't find in 1st. Most of the history that they're covering, although he covers it in different ways, over this period of from 187 to 167, or 161, I'm sorry, BC, is the same history that's found in 1st Maccabees, although said differently. But some of the religious things are quite different, and those are what we'll highlight mostly. The confrontation between Judaism and Hellenism is front and center in 2 Maccabees, much more so than in 1st Maccabees. The writer here implies that the Jews, especially the Jews in Judea and Jerusalem, were still following strict observance of Old Testament law until about 180 BC. In part because the high priest lived such a life and preached such a life. The current high priest in 180 was a man named Onias. He was a very strict observant of ancestral Israelite faith. The masses tend to follow the samples of the example led by a leader, especially in this area of moral and religious behavior and standards. And so that's what the people were doing. It was under that idea that when the leadership changes and changes the mores, then the Maccabees stepped in. Is the idea presented here in 2 Maccabees. The trouble starts with outsiders, according to 2 Maccabees, when, that is, with outsiders invading their religion and interfering in it or trying to change the Jewish faith, in that when insiders begin to disagree with what was going on in the temple. The writer, as he describes this, coins a term. And guess what that term is? It's Judaism, or Judaism. In chapter 2, verse 21, you see this word, and literary scholars tell us this is the very first time in literature that that word appears. And that it's not coming from a word in common use, but instead this author has coined this because he wants to use it in his debate here with Hellenism. And so he's going to use it to contrast the religion that's coming from Second Temple under Onias versus what's the Hellenists, the Greeks, want to do to the religion and what they're practicing themselves. And so he then refers to Hellenism as a barbarianism or barbarian faith, which is quite interesting because the Greeks of the time, in early history, the Greeks actually sort of coined this term barbarian, considering that anybody who did not follow the Greek culture and the Greek religion was a barbarian. And so he flips this writer flips this idea on the reader by turning it around and saying it's in fact Hellenism that's barbarianism. Because at that time, up until that time, although these people were of Judah, that is of the nation of Judah, they referred to themselves as Israelites. They considered themselves the remnant of the Israelites that God had chosen. The Greek Empire at this time was in serious trouble financially. uh, because from one, and this time meaning about 180 to 178 BC, because in 188 BC, the Greeks lost a major military campaign against the Romans, and the Romans imposed very heavy indemnity on the Greeks. And so the Greeks needed cash now, as the commercial goes. And they were looking for cash wherever they could find it. And a leading Jew in the temple had an idea of how to help the king find some cash, because he knew where some was in the temple. And his standings with the high priest were beginning to erode, so he was looking for influence in another circle as well. According to this writer, the conflict that initially brings the Seleucids, Syrians, Greeks, all those terms applicable, into the Jewish temple and religion is driven by their search for this cash to pay this indemnity. And this aspect is different than what First Maccabees did, because First Maccabees implies they started out with a religious, driving a religious bargain, and that's not the position here. It's driven by looking for money, and the religious aspects will come because of the reaction of the people over the money. A Jewish captain of the temple was in a disagreement with the high priest over the administration of the city market. Now, what the specifics of that disagreement were are not covered or mentioned here, and I did not find specific references in history that help us any there. This captain goes around his chain of command and directly to the Syrian satrap of the satrapy, which included Judea. Judea was only a small part in this large satrap, and so this Syrian governor is who he goes to, looking for influence, and also divulges then that there are deposits in the temple that cannot be, excuse me, accounted or reckoned, as he says, as the author says, recognized in association with sacrifices. Your king can get access to this money, is the idea. Some of these funds were supposedly on deposit by wealthy Jews that were loyal to the Egyptians and not to the Syrians. And so therefore we need to remember that until just 25 years before, the Ptolemies or Egyptians were actually for 100 years had ruled this area. So that's part of the debate that's going on here. When all this is reported to the king, he sends an agent named Hellenism to confiscate these funds as king's money. But the high priest says these are not deposits on funds from people. This is the widow as an orphan's fund, meaning a religious tithe. Now, what does that mean? The writer assumes you know. So let's break that down. You need to understand that the Jews of the time, as taught in the Old Testament, Jews didn't pay just one tithe, they paid 3 tithes. The first tithe was 10% of their increase. It was paid every year, and it went for normal religious activities, excuse me, and including the normal upkeep of the temple and so forth. The second tithe was another 10% that was due every year, but it was primarily used to support the 7 holy day festival seasons that they had, to include the festivals themselves, and especially those that involve travel, the spring one, Passover, and the fall one, feast season, for the people to be able to travel using those funds. That one was also due every year. And then in the 3rd and 6th year of every 7-year time cycle, a 3rd tithe was required, another 10%. meaning in some years these people had to pay 30% to the temple. That tithe was specifically used for the support of widows and orphans. That fund did not have to be spent out each year like the other two. Instead, the need varied every year, although the amount of funds coming in were relatively stable. And so there were times, and this may have been one of them, which considerable funds were accumulated in that fund. So the high priest is saying here to Heliodoros that truly these are not king's money, these is church or temple money, and not someone's deposits. Whether the temple was also acting as a bank of safety deposit is not clear. It's debated by scholars, historical scholars. Some of them argue very strongly it was in fact being operated as a bank also. But that's not the argument that's being presented that the people are going to react to. It appears word got out to the common Jewish people that Heliodoros was there to confiscate the widows and orphan third tithe fund. And the people took to the streets. Not just any protest right, mind you, but one that brings out even the teenage daughters, he says. What does that mean? We covered in earlier books of the Apocrypha how the social mores, norms that were involved with teenage daughters. Those teenage daughters were clustered totally inside the house until they were married. And so he's saying here, this is so disturbing to the common Jew, so disrupting to our society that even our normal social mores were broken down and everybody was in the street trying to get this message over that we do not want that bothered. I mean, buried in this is this idea that some things are worth breaking moral codes, moral norms, to protest, to send a clear message. This writer goes even further in his metaphor here and implies that this Greek move upset the gods and the god and angels were involved, figuratively anyway, as scholars say this is metaphoric language, gets involved and attacks Heliodoros and his people. One of the descriptions is of a horse and a young boy, or an angel boy, if you will, flogs Heliodoros near to death. He barely escapes with his life, making the statement as he exits that God watches over this temple and brings it aid. When Heliodoros reports back to his Syrian king of his failure, the king asked him for a recommendation on who and what he needed to send to resolve this issue. And the reply here is that Heliodoros says, send your worst enemy if you have one. In chapter 4, the bad king of First Maccabees, which would be Antiochus IV, plans to appeal to the what he does, he plans to appease these Jews by offering them something that he thinks they can't refuse. And so, according to this, he's offering them Greek citizenship, full Greek citizenship, if they will register as Greek citizens of Antioch and enroll in the gymnasium / educational programs that were there. He plans to rename Jerusalem Antioch in Jerusalem. By then, they had a different high priest named Jason. And remember from First Maccabees, he bought his way in through favors, through getting an appointment by the king and the high priest. So there's someone here at least favorable to them and so forth. And he argues this is something we should do because this would be favorable to us as for commercial and culture advantages. So many Jews adopted this, changing again. In other words, the Maoris changed the ruler, so the people, large numbers of them, adopt this idea and become very Hellenized. And there are others, though, who remain loyal to the religion, refuse to be Hellenized, and of course, that's the story of when the Hasmoneans and the Maccabees step in. And also, this is also when a number of political parties, I should say political-religious party, such as Sadducees and Essenes and so forth, begin to form. In chapter 6, the writer gives more specifics as to how the Greeks went about attacking the Jewish religion. We learn that this king first asked the Athenian Senate, Greek Senate, to specifically forbid the ancestral Jewish religion, to eliminate the ancestral Mosaic law, and force full acceptance of Greek law and customs by the people of Jewish heritage wherever they be in his kingdom, be it in the diaspora, be it in Judea, or be it in Samaria. To pollute the temple by sacrificing animals that the Greeks considered worthy of sacrifice, that were considered, many of which were unclean in Jewish tradition, such as swine. Furthermore, to rededicate the temple in both Jerusalem, that is the second temple, and the Samaritan temple, to the Olympian god Zeus, and to establish in those temples prostitution within the temple as a form of fertility worship, and to forsake all holy days and seasons being used by the Jews and the Samaritans in their worship, and substitute instead Greek holidays, I should say, including a monthly celebration of the king's birthday in which all citizens were to participate in a promenade. In chapter 6 and 8, the narrative is presented in a manner to emphasize that all this bad stuff against the Jews excuse me, is done on behalf of God to punish and discipline the people. He also emphasizes that the common Jewish people are receiving this punishment as a type of martyrdom. And furthermore, that all martyrdom is not just coming off of battlefields, that although there will be plenty there, that the average Jew is being martyred as well. There is a school of Christian scholarship that's often inserted in footnotes in the compendias at this point that ties early Christian martyrdom to a similar philosophy, similar idea, and extends it further in that underlying to martyrdom is the idea there is a reward in life afterwards, or if not full resurrection, at least some sort of form of afterlife. Clearly, martyrdom was held in very high regards in Greek society by this time, as was resurrection of the dead by these people. And so there's this idea that many scholars bring out that in part what's going on during Hellenization is the Greek ideas in these areas are being brought into Judaism, and this writer is trying to use martyrdom as sort of a tool to help initiate that understanding and acceptance of that idea. This writer of 2nd Maccabees goes into much more detail about the martyrdom, specifically of 9 people. First, of an old man named Eleazar, as well as that of a mother and her 7 sons. Eleazar was a scribe to the high priest. He was a very advanced age, and they were forcing him to eat pork. He refused and died on the rack. Horrible death. The horrible deaths of each of these 7 sons before each brother and their mother is described in detail here. Such things all happening while they're still alive as piecemeal butchery, scalding them in water, frying them in frying pans, and so forth. Each martyr, though claiming he prefers death to dishonor in his ancestral faith. And then, above all, the mother at the end adds that she was most admirable that she had raised 7 sons to hold fast to their religion and to honor their people, even in the face of death. And O. Eleazar, before he died, he says, I welcome death with honor over polluting my body with pork or with swine and violating my ancestral Jewish faith. Scholars add, this is all written in 2 Maccabees to instill negative emotional reaction towards the Greeks in favor of the Jews and their ancestral faith. And some argue also to help add support to this emerging idea of resurrection of the dead, a life after death, etc. We'll continue in our study of 2 Maccabees next week. Moving right along. Hope you have a good Bible study.